Good evening, everyone. It feels slightly odd to be giving the Birmingham, Midlands and Classics Association New Year lecture in February. But then last night I remembered that we are in fact in the middle of a new year. Does anyone know which? Chinese, thank you very much, the year of the pig. 5th of February, sorry, to the 19th of February. And then that reminded me that actually time, or rather the way that time is marked and recorded in its passage, is a social construct. Which is a nice segue into the Roman world, because originally the Roman calendar was based on the lunar cycle and was only 10 months long, with some rather confusing intercalendary months thrown in there when they needed to catch up with the solar cycle. And the Roman year traditionally began in March. So we haven't even reached the Roman New Year yet. And actually there are hints of this in our current calendar. So if you think of the last 4 months of the year, September, October, November, December, those are months 7, 8, 9, 10. However, Rome did go on to adapt a 12-month calendar from the Greeks and added January and February to the beginning of the year. Where am I going with this, you're asking? I want to point out there's a distinction in the function between a calendar year, so from January to December, and within the Roman political framework, what we refer to as a consular year. And that is the period of time during which the consuls, the heads of state, were in office. And it can begin, or could begin, on any day of the calendar year. And it could be shorter than a calendar year. However, it was only in 153 BC that the consuls began to enter office on the 1st of January. Before this date, no. Prior to this, the evidence suggests that between around 220 and 153 BC, the consuls entered office on the 15th of March. Before this point, there does not seem to be a fixed period of time, a fixed date on which the consuls entered March. Now, the 15th of March, or as it's perhaps more well known to a lot of you, the Ides of March, was a day that was sacred both to Jupiter and also Anna Perenna, who was a minor deity who embodied the reoccurring cycle of the year, and so the return of the new year. Remembering again that March is the original start of the Roman year. So at least from a late Republican perspective, March the 15th was an older, fixed date, as it were, for the consuls to enter office each year. And we'll come back to the potential significance of March as the original New Year later on, but I just want you to hold this rather flexible Republican framework of time and a pre-Julian calendar in mind, as it ties into one of the major issues of the late Republic, which is the contentions over where power in the state lies. Or to push us a bit further, what should the res publica, and that is what the Romans referred to as the state, what should it look like structurally, socially, temporally, and morally? Who gets to say what the Roman state should be? And what I want to stress today is that part of the debate and contention during the civil wars of the late Republic can be understood or framed through an inquiry as to whose version of the res publica is the right one or the correct one, in a world where all the major political players espouse to uphold the ideals of the state. Sounds not unfamiliar to current political climate. So with this in mind, let's actually get on to some violence. Now, before I get into the main point of the talk, I have a few replicas that I'm going to pass round. These are replicas of objects used during Rome's civil war. And as there are quite a few of you, I'll pass them around now. The materials I've made these from are not entirely accurate. I've made these from clay with something else inside to give it some weight, and I've painted them. But the size of them and the weight of them is fairly accurate. So I'm just going to pass these round. We will come back to them later, one on one side of the room, one on the other. There you go. Just pass around, have a look, have a thought, and we'll come back to them, as I say, later on. And I should also issue a warning at this point that some of the material I will be mentioning later in the lecture is of a graphic nature in terms of sexual violence. So I just put that out there as a potential warning. And I will indicate when we get to that point of the talk. So in order to understand the fight for the Republic and the pressures exerted on language and identity of the individuals involved in the period of civil war, I want to jump forward to a monument that might be understood to epitomise the polar opposite of violence and bloodshed of the 40s and 30s. Here we go. This is the monument which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, particularly if you were fortunate enough to attend Amy Russell's lecture last year. The Ara Pacis Augusti, as a senatorial monument to Augustan peace, or indeed August peace, was a senatorial expression of an idealised depiction of the Roman state, with Augustus himself within that depiction. And it was conceptualised through the language of peace. Yet this is the first extant example we have of a true cult, a religious practice, to Pax. And this makes Pax a latecomer to the party in terms of the ideals that were deified and worshipped by the Romans. Other divine qualities or ideals associated with the well-being of the Roman state received cult very early in Rome's history. Some examples. So Sallust, or health, as early as 311. Concordia, which means agreement, 304. Fides, loyalty, by the mid-3rd century. And 2 iterations of fortuna publica, public good fortune. Pax as an internal civic ideal and deity is, I would and have indeed argued, is a product of Rome's civil wars. But what does Pax actually mean? Obviously, we translate it as peace, but there are various words in the Roman framework that are used to talk about peace. In one sense, Pax is describing individual personal relationships. And that could be a relationship with an individual god. So we have evidence from Plautus, who was a playwright, of people asking for Pax with Asclepius for good health, but also to Jupiter and to Venus for their protection. We also see it between individuals. And again, from Plautus, we have this wonderful passage where a son is asking or hoping that his mother and his father will make peace, because at the moment she's really angry with him. So, internal domestic disputes as well can be included in Pax. On a more sort of national or state level, there is the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods or the peace with the gods. So the relationship of the Roman state to the gods was something that the Romans, as a united community, sought to maintain, or rather achieve, as a state of stability and security for the res publica, the people and the army. And in the early books of Livy's history, we see the Pax Deorum is sought in response to pestilence, to epidemics, and also in preparation for military activity. And there's a great concern to express that Pax is unattainable, or that it's really hard to maintain. The notion of the Pax Deorum provided a model for how human relations of peace and negotiation were seen by the Romans, particularly in terms of interstate relations. I should add, it's the relationship of inequality, which the following passage of Livy quite nicely articulates. This is Livy's account of Zeuxis' embassy to Scipio after the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC. Zeuxis says, "We ask of you Romans, through what offering we can expiate the mistake of our king and obtain peace and forgiveness from you, the victors. Always with the greatest spirit you have given pardon to conquered kings and peoples. How much more great and propitiatory ought you to be in this victory, which has made you masters of the world? You ought now to set aside fighting with all men and, like the gods, protect and spare the human race." In many respects, as this passage shows, Pax express an unequal relationship, at least from the Roman point of view, where they, as the victors, the stronger party, granted and bestowed peace on the weaker ones. To ask for peace was a sign of weakness and defeat, at least in the Romans' eyes. Now, whilst it's wrong to say that peace was merely the absence of war, it was in many respects its polar opposite. Pax, or peace, was the state achieved after battle was over. Or, as we see in interstate relations, it was a state offered to describe stable relations between communities instead of war. Or, as hopefully, yes, there we go, this passage of Gellius shows, which is recording a Roman diplomatic embassy to the Carthaginians before the outbreak of the Hannibalic War, describing a stable relationship between communities that counterbalance the state of war. So this embassy says that the Roman people sent to the Carthaginians a spear, a hasta, and a herald staff, a caduceus, two signs of war and peace, from which they, the Carthaginians, were to choose whichever they wanted. Pax was in many respects a means of formulating a relationship with the other, as something that was outside your own community or indeed outside your own self-identity, be that with a god, with the divine, or with another political community. Nevertheless, the celebration of peace from the mid-40s BC onwards centered around an internal discourse on the nature of the state. Firstly, Pax started to become a means of expressing relationships between warring Romans, replacing or at least adding to a more stable civic terminology such as concordia, which Cicero used particularly in the 60s. He talks of the concordia ordinum, the harmony of Rome's social orders. And we see this increased use in Pax from Cicero's letters, where he talks about the need for peace between Caesar and Pompey before the outbreak of the war in 49 and also after it, or even his rejection of a possibility of peace with Mark Antony, and we see this in his Philippics. And this idea of peace is also articulated in this coin. And this is the first definitive presentation of Pax as a personified abstraction or a divine quality. This is a small coin that was minted in Rome in 44 BC on behalf of Julius Caesar, and it was part of a much, much larger Caesarian program in terms of the coinage of that year. We have, on the obverse, on the head side of the coin, a rather hard to see female head, and we wouldn't know who it was if it wasn't for the writing identifying her as Pax. But it's actually the reverse of the coin, the tail side, this side of the coin, that offers us a way into understanding what this form of Pax, of peace, was meant to be. Can anyone make out what this image is? Handshaking, exactly. And what does that mean? When do we shake hands? In agreement, exactly. This is a really simple codified way of saying agreement, fides, loyalty, concordia, agreement. And let's remember, this coin is being minted in 44. This is Julius Caesar's message of what his version of peace is. But this is also when he has virtually unchallenged control of the Roman state. On the 26th of January in this year, he was appointed Dictator Perpetuo, which, and here we have a coin, indeed, calling him Kaiser Dictator Perpetuo. This does not mean dictator for life, as is often assumed, and this interpretation is based on later accounts by Greek authors such as Plutarch, Dio Cassius, and Appian. But as Theodore Buttrey has convincingly argued, this means dictator without interruption or continuously. And in a way, this echoes what Caesar was doing with the regular Roman magistracies during his dictatorship, which was pre-appointing office holders for the next 3 years. So rather than having normal elections, he decided who was going to be praetors and consuls for the next 3 years, whilst he was going to be away fighting the Parthians, in order to ensure the smooth running of the state. And similarly with his dictatorship, he was just going to be dictator continuously until he came back. It was not, as I think we are all aware, an entirely successful move. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the 15th of March in the Senate House connected to Pompey's theatre complex on the Campus Martius may count amongst the most iconic moments of Rome's civil war period. For Brutus, Cassius, and the other conspirators, their act of violence against the head of state was a rejection of his pronouncements of the peace he claimed to champion and offer. They rather took up the slogan of libertas, of liberty against the tyrant, as Caesar seems to have been conceptualized by his peers. Cicero, at least after the event, in this letter, which is actually written to a personal friend of Caesar, states that his death was justified. If Caesar was a king, si Caesar rex fuit, which indeed seems to me to have been the case, quod mihi quidem videntur. Cicero believes that Caesar really was a king, and therefore his fate was justified. However, we should remember that Caesar was not the first Roman to be accused of kingship. Tiberius Gracchus, Sulla, Pompey, and even Cicero had at various points been accused of aiming at kingship within a political discourse. Cicero was doubly attacked for being a foreign king. Not only was he acting tyrannically, apparently, but he was a foreigner for a Marpinum, which was a double blow. And several of his opponents in the 60s accused him of being a king. Nevertheless, the image of Caesar as a tyrant was a powerful one for his opponents. The idea and image of tyrannicide, symbolized on this coin which Brutus minted between 43 and 42 when he was in the East, and symbolized through the Peleus, which is a freedman's cap, a symbol of freedom and libertas, and obviously the two daggers, were intimately tied on this coin to the writing, the legend on this reverse side, Ide March. This is the Ides of March. This is quite unique in Roman coinage, or almost unique, to find a day. This is basically saying the 15th of March on the coin. You don't normally find that. And this coin is so well known that Dio Cassius, who's writing a lot later, actually talks about this coin. It's quite rare to hear coins talked about in this way in the sources. Whilst later sources stressed a sense of urgency for the conspirators, Caesar apparently was going to be departing on his Parthian campaign in 4 days' time, so they've got to kill him now, otherwise they won't have the chance. There seems to have been a significance of the date itself, which I have repeatedly emphasised. The 15th of March, as I said previously, was a feast to Jupiter, king of the gods, and also the festival of Anna Perenna, that deity who symbolised the renewal of the year. It was also, as we've previously seen, the date on which the new consuls, at least in a period of time in the Republic, took up office. The year previously, in 45, Caesar had recalculated Rome's calendar. It had got so messed up with these intercalendary months that he reformulated the calendar to the Julian calendar we know today. So in this framework, the Ides of March might also represent for the conspirators an assertion of a republican framework, one associated with renewal and the consular year, not the calendar year, the consular year. So stressing something separate and republican from Caesar. Of course, all this high ideology does not detract from the fact that Caesar's removal was a highly violent and brutal event. Cicero might have dressed up the Ides of March as that glorious banquet, as he refers to it in a letter. But the event, which Cicero apparently was not privy to, was also the realization of much of Cicero's own rhetoric for the violent removal of political opponents, who he deemed a cancer on the state. These are just some extracts of Cicero's speeches and letters from the mid-60s until the mid-50s, where he vacillates between a non-invasive medical treatment for the well-being of the state versus a violent surgical operation. So in his second Catiline speech, he says, "What can be cured, I shall cure by all means possible. What can be cut back, I shall not allow to remain to the destruction of the citizen body." However, in 60, he says, "There ought remedies which cure diseased parts of the state should be preferable to ones that amputate them." And then again in 57, "I'm starting this diet treatment. I'm tired of surgery." However, the next year, the ones who heal the Republic are those who cut out some plague as if it were a tumour on the citizen's body. Sounds quite a lot like the Ides of March in a sense. And returning to that fateful day, if anyone has not seen Carry On Clear, I highly recommend it. It's terribly historically inaccurate, but it's great fun. It's got some of the best jokes and puns in British comedy. But that aside, does anyone know the phrase that Caesar was purported to have said when Brutus struck him? Ooh, okay, you're one step ahead of me. I did hear et tu Brute, but someone's read their Suetonius. So yes, famously thanks to Shakespeare, et tu Brute is the phrase that we associate with Caesar. And to be in all fairness, Shakespeare knew his Plutarch, or at least a translated version of Plutarch. However, as we've just heard from an alert member of the audience, Caesar, according to Suetonius' account, there were those who said that as Brutus was rushing at him, he said, "Kai su teknon," And that does, in a sense, literally translate as "and you," child or boy, so et tu there. But there may be a more coded message behind this than this saying "and you, boy." And to understand this, I want to take us to Roman Antioch. This is a mosaic from the imperial period, from the house of the evil eye, so named because of this mosaic. Because what we have in this mosaic is the evil eye that is being attacked by a multitude of things. We've got a crow pecking out the eye, a trident, a dagger, a scorpion, a snake, a dog, a centipede, some sort of small leopard-like cat, and then this figure in front of it all, who is a figure of short stature playing the reed pipes. And he's normally interpreted as being a dwarf because his limbs are short. Coupled with that, there's something protruding from his legs backwards towards the eye, which looks rather large in comparison to his limbs, because he's a dwarf. And it is, of course, his penis, pointing backwards, attacking the evil eye. So all the ways the wall of evil you can possibly imagine, and above all this is some writing, which is in Greek, kai su. That is a lunate sigma, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. But kai su, this seems to imply that this is another way of warding off evil, a verbal curse, as opposed to the various physical attacks going on. So in fact, was Caesar basically sort of telling Brutus where to go in his last moments? Caesar's assassination is the culmination, although of course not the terminus, of several aspects of violent language and ideology in the political struggles of the late Republic. Charges of kingship, tyranny, alongside the promotion of political ideals like pax and libertas, freedom, as well as actual violent physical removal of political opponents. However, while Caesar was portrayed as a tyrant, he was not explicitly presented as an enemy of the Roman state. Here we get on some technical language stuff. Enemies of the Roman state, in terms of external opponents from other communities, are hostes, public enemy of the state, someone who is not a citizen, and is characterized as being at war with Rome rather than at peace. However, we start to see hostis creep into political language. This is from Cicero's fourth Catilinarian speech delivered to the Senate on the 5th of December in the debate about what was going to happen to the conspirators at court. And Cicero says, regarding these conspirators, "I exclude these men and I gladly count them as separate, and I think that they should be numbered amongst not morally unsound citizens, but the most bitter enemies of the state." So these aren't cives, these aren't citizens, these are hostes. In fact, they're not hostes, they are in fact citizens, but Cicero is deliberately trying to sort of frame them as something which is external to the state. And indeed, there's other terminology to refer to enemies in the state. There's imicus, which is a personal enemy, and hostis, which is someone who is defined in relation to the Roman state as opposed to an individual. This distinction is not just about public versus private relations. It also entails a direct and violent confrontation of someone's status, as opposed to merely someone's attitude to them. And we can see this being used, for example, in Caesar's civil wars. So he uses imicus, so personal opponent, 17 times, mainly in Book 1. But he uses hostis 69 times, spread out throughout the books, 15 times in Book 1, 30 times in Book 2, and 24 times in Book 3. Hostis only appears from Book 1, chapter 41 onwards, after which imicus doesn't appear until the 3 instances in Book 3. So he's making a definitive switch between his opponents being just personal opponents and being actual enemies of the state. Now, obviously there's a certain amount of political weight behind terming someone as an enemy of the state, as Cicero is trying to do with the Catilinarian conspirators, and Caesar is trying to present his opponents in a similar light. However, during the first of Rome's civil wars, and this is the war between Marius and Sulla in 88 BC, when Sulla marches his army on Rome, we can observe the development of the application not merely of identities and labels that de-Romanize one's political opponents in a sort of conceptual framework, as these are sort of trying to do, but with technical mechanisms that actually alter a person's legal and political status. So Sulla introduces something that's referred to in the scholarship as hostis declarations, literally declaring someone a hostis, an enemy of the state. And it's unclear from the sources whether this is a law, So it's something that's passed through the assemblies or a decree of the Senate. But either way, the texts tell us that the Senate judge someone to be hostis. And this is not just merely saying you're a bad person. This is saying you are no longer a citizen. Your rights as a citizen, therefore the protection you have as a citizen, because there are various laws that protect a Roman citizen's person, have been removed. You have been put in opposition to the state. And this becomes a tool for attacking one's political opponents, and it becomes repeatedly used throughout the course of the late Republic. This is the table of all the instances from Sulla's introduction down to 40 BC where hostis declarations have been used against various Romans. You can see Sulla uses it in 88 against Marius and his supporters, and it gets used against Sulla the next year. So obviously it's flexible in its application. But this is a way of legitimizing violence against citizens by altering their status. If you're no longer a citizen, anyone can do anything to you. You're not protected. And there's another practice that is also introduced by Sulla, but this time in 81 when he's dictator, and that is the prescriptions. So these are, in brief, a list of named individuals whose lives and property become forfeit to the state by those who hold political power for the restoration of the state, i.e. Sulla as dictator for the restoration of the state. And then the only other time it happens is in the triumviral period, so when Mark Antony, Lepidus and Octavian are in control of the state for the purposes of restoring the state, they also use this mechanism. Such an enactment serves several purposes. It facilitates the removal of political opponents. It provides potential funds from the confiscation of someone's estate and their wealth for the current regime. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrates the energy and vigour through which those in power were striving to bring stability to the state by whatever means necessary, and including cutting out what they saw as cancerous, to borrow Cicero's words. So I recall vividly when I was an undergraduate, a tutor of mine outlining what they described as the most violent act of the late Republic. And it's not the assassination of Caesar. In 43 BC, Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, removed a hairpin from her head and pierced the tongue of the dead orator Cicero, whose head and hands had been displayed on the speaker's platform in the Roman Forum. And this is a violent act in several different ways. Firstly, Cicero's execution under the tenuous legality of the prescriptions speaks of the extreme physical violence meted out against political opponents in the name of restoring the state. That such acts were deemed nominally necessary highlights the severity of Rome's internal political situation and the loss of civil liberties. Of course, Cicero himself had advocated similar things against his opponents, Catiline, Clodius, Antony, as the passages we saw about violent surgery. Secondly, it's not just that Cicero had been prescribed and executed. It was that Antony, according to the later historians, Appian and Dio Cassius, and also Plutarch, took immense amounts of relish in displaying Cicero's remains both at his dining room table, which quite frankly sounds very unhygienic, and at the centre of Rome's public and political life, in the Forum, specifically on the speaker's platform. And finally, the ultimate violation is Fulvia's. A very public attack deliberately highlights the means through which Cicero himself has attacked Antony and Fulvia, through his speeches and his writings. The violence of his words brought about violence against his own person. And this is just a passage from Dio Cassius, who really emphasises both the public space within which this display is happening and also Fulvia's role. So the head of Cicero was brought to them one day. Antony uttered many bitter reproaches against it and ordered it to be exposed on the rostra, more prominently than the rest, i.e. he's not the only head on the rostra, that might be seen in the very place where Cicero had so often been heard declaiming against him, together with his right hand, just as it had been cut off. Fulvia took the head into her hands before it was removed, and after abusing it spitefully and spitting upon it, set on her knees, opened the mouth, pulled out the tongue, which she pierced with pins that she used for her hair, at the same time uttering many brutal jests. Now, Dio Cassius is the only one who mentions Fulvia in the account. Appian and Plutarch exclude her, which is, of course, interesting. And Of course, Cicero's demise, and I say Appian's Appian doesn't include Fulvia, but an interesting note that the head and hands of Cicero were suspended for a long time from the rostra in the Forum, where formerly he'd been accustomed to make public speeches, and more people came together to behold this spectacle than had previously come to listen to him, which I think for Cicero is the final insult. Of course, Cicero's demise was just one act of violence, as we've seen with that passage of Dio Cassius. It wasn't the only head on the rostra. And this a long history of internal destruction of the Roman state over the course of the 1st century BC, not just removing political opponents, but removing their heads. I'm not going to discuss this in detail. I just want to demonstrate the sheer volume of head cutting that goes on in this period. It really stacks up. So these are all the sources that talk specifically about people's heads being chopped off and passed on to their opponents. There are, however, a couple of sources that specifically talk about the display on the rostra. Only 4 of them. My favourite one is Sylla in 82 to the head of Marius the Younger, quoting in Greek from Aristophanes' Knights, "First learn to row before you try to steer." Which, as a rower, I really like. I can't steer. So the rostra is clearly an important place for display. What is the rostra? This is the coin from 45, which depicts on the reverse the rostra. This is the speaker's platform. This is the tribune's sort of bench. And these are the ship's beaks, ship's prows, the rostra from which the rostra gets its name. What's interesting is that on the other side of the coin is a personification of libertas, or technically it's saying libertatis, of liberty. It's interesting that liberty has been combined with a representation of Rome's political public space, tribunician power, sort of constitutional public debate are going hand in hand with liberty. And the appearance of liberty as a personification of the freedom of an individual citizen is also relevant to contemporary events. At 45 BC, Caesar was regarded as the liberator of the state following the final destruction of the Pompeians at Munda in Spain. This coin is minted on his behalf. And this also illustrates the fluidity of political ideology. Caesar, the liberator of the state, 1 year later is assassinated in the name of liberty. So, but liberty is strongly associated with, obviously, the rostra, at least this coin demonstrates that. But let's think about it in more of a sort of topographical sense, whereas the rostra, it's in the Roman Forum. This is a map of the Roman Forum around the 1st century BC, although it's slightly different from what the Forum would have looked like when Cicero's head was on it. Because Julius Caesar, in sort of the last couple of years of his life, moves the Senate House, which is here in its traditional Republican setting, so that it's sort of here and connects with his own Forum, which he builds later. And the rostra also gets moved. But in the sort of broader context of the late Republic, this is what the Forum looks like. This is the Senate House, the Comitium, an open-air sort of debating area, the rostra, and the Forum proper. And traditionally, a speaker would stand on the rostra and speak into the Comitia towards the Senate House. And the people in the Forum aren't involved so much in the debate. However, in 145 BC, supposedly for the first time, a tribune turns away from the Comitia, Senate-centred debating area, and turns to face the Roman people, which is an act that Gaius Gracchus is also famous for doing in his tribunate. So, I mean, this is really, this event in the sort of the mid-2nd century BC is, this turning away from the Comitium to the Forum is about breaking political convention and creating disruption, and also challenging where power in the state lies. The tribunes are saying it no longer lies with the Senate. Power belongs to the people through political debate and discourse. So the rostra is central to political life, action, and debate in the late Republic. It's also a place where Rome's statesmen who have done many great things for the state are commemorated. So Cicero tells us in his Philippics that we see statues on the rostra of those who have met death on behalf of the Republic. And he's thinking in this instance particularly of legates and embassies, Roman diplomats who are going out to negotiate on Rome's behalf and who have died in that service. It's also a space where people who aren't diplomats but have done great things, supposedly on behalf of the state. So Sulla receives a gilded equestrian statue on the rostra. And Appian says everything Sulla had done as consul or as proconsul was confirmed, ratified, and his gilded equestrian statue was erected in front of the rostra with the inscription Cornelius Sulla, the ever fortunate, for so his flatterers called him on account of his unbroken success. And on his death, his body is displayed there. Similarly, Pompey receives an equestrian statue there. And we have references in Plutarch's Life of Caesar and Cicero that they had been removed after his sort of defeat, but that Caesar actually put them back up again. So this is a space where you commemorate the great and the good of the Roman state. What we see with the acts of violence then is a sort of subversion of this practice of what the rostra is meant to be about. So we've got the rostra, which is symbolic of the ideals of the Roman state, that is then being harnessed for a ritualized display of violence against political opponents. The purpose is to commemorate victory and to celebrate the defeat of a delegitimized Roman opponent. Of course, victory celebration was a common occurrence in the Roman world, and it's a traditional space where you display victory over the enemies, most famously, obviously, in the Triumph. This is a relief from the Arch of Titus in the Roman Forum. So it dates to the end of the 2nd century AD, and it commemorates Titus's victory over Judea. And we can see the spoils of the Judea with the menorah here. And such displays were obviously considered normal and appropriate when you're dealing with an external opponent. But how does it work when civil war is being fought against a Roman? Can you commemorate a triumph like this over another Roman citizen? Well, Caesar seems to have tried it. But there's a fine line between victory and triumph when you're dealing with citizens. Now, in 46, he celebrates 4 triumphs. At least 2 of them are definitely over external opponents. But then it gets slightly complicated with wars in Africa, because he's both fighting African royalty, but also Roman republicans. And Appian tells us, although he took care not to inscribe any Roman names in his triumph, because placards are carried in Roman triumphs, to let the audience know who are these various people that they're celebrating victory over, as it would have been unseemly in his eyes and base and inauspicious in those of the Roman people to triumph over fellow citizens. Yet all these misfortunes were represented in the processions, and the men also by various images and pictures. So again, we get pictorial displays of the great things that victors did, again to communicate to the audience why they're sort of commemorating these people. All except Pompey, whom alone he did not venture to exhibit, since he was still greatly regretted by all. The people, although restrained by fear, groaned over the domestic ills, especially when they saw the picture of Lucius Scipio, general-in-chief, wounded in the breast by his own hand and casting himself into the sea, Petronius committing self-destruction at the banquet, and Cato torn apart by himself like a wild beast. Dio also tells us that Caesar's triumph over Munda, over the Pompeians, was also frowned upon by the Roman people. For it commemorated no victory over foreign commanders or barbarian kings, but the utter annihilation of the sons and the family of the mightiest of the Romans. It was not meet for Caesar to celebrate a triumph for calamities of his country, priding himself upon actions which had no defence before gods or men, except that they had been done under necessity. Caesar's treatment of his opponents through his inclusion of them in his triumphs was obviously considered distasteful. Yet, if we follow Appian's account of Cicero's remains, that they drew a larger crowd in death than he did in life, we can see a certain grisly fascination with the destruction of Roman opponents. The ritualized violence that we see during the civil wars, particularly with the beheading of one's civic enemies, was also something that Caesar harnessed to justify his actions in civil war in 49 and 48. And what in particular shapes the relations in his work De Bella Civili, Caesar's Civil War, is his opponent's refusal to accept his peace offers. And this is particularly emphasised in a passage in Book 3, where the two sides, the Pompeian side and the Caesarian side, meet at the river Apsus in Greece. So Caesar's legate says it should not be permissible for citizens to send legates concerning peace to citizens? Should we not, as fellow citizens, communicate and reconcile? So Caesar's legate here is stressing the necessity of peace between fellow citizens. But the response Caesar puts in the mouth of Pompey's legate confirms the choice of violence against the state, rather than reconciliation with Pompey. Let's stop talking about a peace settlement. As far as we are concerned, unless Caesar's head is brought back, there's no possibility of peace. Again, this obsession with cutting off heads. Caesar characterizes the violence of, and indeed the violation intended by Pompey's legate Labienus in a multi-framed way. The explicit act of intended violence against the person of Caesar in itself is an extreme act, an attack on a fellow citizen, allegedly for the achievement of peace, i.e. the termination and resolution of war will bring peace. Indeed, the rejection of peace negotiations in favour of an aggressive stance against a fellow Roman serves to demonstrate that the Pompeians choose violence over peace and stability for the state. Labienus' taunt to the Caesarian legate serves to illustrate the extreme measures and acts of violence that Romans were prepared to commit against fellow Romans. Yet it also highlights Caesar's own manipulation of such presentation. It is all to his benefit to stress the violence against him, and that this was linked to violence against the very fabric of the state. Whether or not Labienus had demanded Caesar's head as a price of peace, Caesar could later claim the ultimate victory of this depiction of his opponent, when in 45 BC, you guessed it, Labienus' head is chopped off and presented to Caesar after the Battle of Munda. So we can see here with this taunt, its violent imagery and the subsequent repercussions, at least for Labienus, how during civil war it was not just actions but also words that helped to construct and depict one's civil opponents. The piece that Labienus is claiming through violence fits into the rhetoric and discourse concerning the stability of the Roman state and how one presented one's opponents as enemies, as hostes to Rome. Indeed, if we recall the violent treatment of Cicero's remains, they were specifically attacked because of the words he had written and spoke. And we can see that the wars for control of the Republic were fought just as much in words as in deeds. With that in mind, we've seen the various ways to characterize an opponent in civil war in order to justify the position that you're taking against them, with ultimate violence used as a justification and proof of your opponent's betrayal of the ideals of the state. Of course, the language of violence and physical violence in battle could also be combined in a more explicit way. And this is where we come on to the section of the talk which will look at explicit sexual violence as a warning, but also the objects I was passing around. Has everyone got a chance to see them? Hopefully. Where are they? Somewhere probably at the back of the room. Excellent. Okay, good. Did anyone have any idea what they might be?
Sling ammunition.
Thank you very much. Exactly. Sling ammunition, sling bullets. There have been a particular one in the Ashmolean, which I was studying with Professor Alison Cooley a few years ago, has been used by Mary Beard and Bethany Hughes in their sort of programs on Rome. Yes, these are sling bullets. These are made from lead. And you'll notice that there's writing on them, and the writing is raised from the surface. It's not scratched into the surface. This is made in a mould. This is mass-produced weaponry, basically, mass-produced bullets. And these particular bullets come from a... Oh yeah, this is an example of the one from the Ashmolean. They come from the Battle of Perusia, which was fought against Octavian's forces on one side, and Mark Antony's forces represented by his brother Lucius and Fulvia on the other. And we know from Appian that the forces of Octavian had the advantage of using missiles, and whilst they were besieging the town, and the Antonines had gladiators who were better at hand-to-hand combat. But we know that both sides were using sling bullet ammunition. The question is, what do these bullets say? So one of them, could anyone make out any of the writing on the bullets, by the way? Yeah. Yes, the one that actually says Caesaris imp. If I can pull them up. Yes, which is this one here, which literally means Caesar Imperator. Does anyone know who this is? Augustus, exactly. Or, yeah, as we call him, Octavian. But at this time, he's calling himself Caesar, Imperator, successful general. Did anyone make out what was written on the other bullet? Got it. and a bit more writing on it, more sides. In fact, referred to Octavian. And this is a replica of a bullet in the Ashmolean, which was originally displayed in the Ashmolean as a sling bullet of Octavian, because it's got his name on it, right? However, it's got more than just Octavian. And as we can see with this other bullet, this Kaiser imp, Octavian doesn't call himself Octavian. Since Caesar's death and his adoption by Caesar, he is Gaius Julius Caesar. Calling himself Octavian is a reminder of his slightly more humble origins. It's not a name he uses, it's a name his opponents use. And in fact, that second bullet, which is not on any of this display, it's addressing him. So it's coming from the opponents. And it's saying Fellas Octavi, which in sort of polite 19th century translation would be perform the act of fellatio, Octavian. But as this is being flung by soldiers, it's basically you suck cock. And we know who's throwing it because they put their name on it. The final side, which has L-E-X-E, is an abbreviation for Legione Decem, the 10th Equestrian Legion. And this is an Antonine legion. So what we're seeing is, and this accompanies a whole range of other really quite graphic ones. This one here is again addressing Octavian, and this is insulting him. You're not Caesar. You're Octavianus. This is saying, loose Octavian, sit on this. And guess what? Yeah, it's a phallus. Likewise, we have another bullet which has, again, a phallus on it. There are other bullets. This one here, this is the bullet speaking in the first person, peto. I seek, Fulvii, something of Fulvia. And it's often been interpreted as, here it is, seeking Fulvia's clitoris. There are also sling bullets, this one here, which address both Lucius Antonius and Fulvia. Lucius Antonius Baldi, spread your ass. Open wide, get ready to receive this. And yeah, it is highly amusing because it is. This is not unlike sort of bombs being dropped saying, up yours, Saddam, or something. But at the same time, you've got to remember that these are Romans talking about Romans, and it's really, really aggressive, violent language. This is about penetrating someone, both physically, in many ways, in fact. But we also have to remember that some sling bullets are completely normal. Caesar Imperator is not rude, it's not aggressive. It's just legitimizing who is throwing the bullet. And likewise, we've got ones which talk about which legion is throwing them. And that's kind of the more standard thing you would expect to see on sling bullets. Other bullets from slave wars in Sicily will just call on the gods for protection and help, or give the name of the various commanding units. But we see particular violent sexual language in the Civil War. How do you sort of, de-Romanize a Roman? You make them the victims of being passive and penetrated. So the violence of this language at Perusia was, however, rapidly replaced with overtures of reconciliation, peace, and stability. Because we get the Peace of Brundisium in 40, where Mark Antony and Octavian make up. And Fulvia's dead by this point, so Octavian can marry his sister to Antony, and everyone's happy for a little bit. And this is reflected in the poetry of the time. So Virgil's Eclogues 4, the dramatic context for this poetic idealism of a world released from the terror of civil war, is presented as Asinius Pollio's consulship in 40, and it's his anticipated consulship. It will begin. And whether the poem implicitly refers to the Treaty of Brundisium, which was in September or October 40, and Pollio was one of the people actually involved in negotiating the peace, or whether it's a product of the earlier uncertainty in 41, because Pollio would have been elected in 41 for the next year. So looking forward to a happier future potentially with Pollio. It nevertheless was shaped by the socio-political climate of the late 40s, particularly the land confiscations of 41, which led to the siege of Perusia and all that horribly violent language. And those issues also colour Eclogues 1 and 9. So in the wake of the siege of Perusia, Virgil's idyll of a peaceful world without war, so peccatum quae orbem, the world at peace, looks to the end of the conflict. And certainly by 33, there was a flurry of enthusiasm for reconciliation, peace and agreement, which abounds on the coinage. There we go. Mark Antony and Octavian are putting each other on each other's coinage. Antony's coinage has Octavia and Antony together, and this coin of Octavian has, again, like those joined hands of peace, and behind it that caduceus, the symbol of peace, with a female figure who's often thought to maybe be Concordia, or perhaps peace. But also, this is not just the military political leaders saying everything's great and rosy. This is an inscription from Casinum in Italy, which is thought to be a newly founded colony, actually, in the wake of the fighting. And what this it's the two local magistrates who are dedicating a signum concordiae, some monument to Concordia. And the date of this inscription is end of September. October. October 40. This is the same time as the Peace of Brundisium, so they seem to be responding to that. On a more local level, concerns are being met. We've got peace, things are going to be better. While such optimism was ultimately short-lived, and indeed Horace's account of his journey to Brundisium in Satires 1:5 hints at continued attempts to bring about an accord of friendship between the two sides, this should not detract from the powerful sway that the idea of peace held in 40, and will continue to hold. However, whilst the role of peace during the 40s and 30s in the discourse and debates over the res publica represented attempts at reconciliation between opposing Roman sides, the peace that was commemorated after the victory at Actium, in the Victory Monument there, and also in the later Ara Parcus Augusti, was a message not of peace as a relative, and by that I mean not having peace in relation to someone else, but as an absolute, because there was no one left to contend with or to negotiate with. But that is a story for another day. So thank you.